Hello, my name is Brian Mabry, and I am with Kendig Keast Collaborative.
And I'm Steve Sizemore with Kendig Keast Collaborative.
And we are with the firm that the city has hired to update its Unified Land Development Code, or ULDC. This is an important document that regulates land development in the city. And this presentation will give you an update as to where we are in the process, as well as provide a summary of a lot of the key information that you'll find in this document. Also, we'll show you kind of where we are timeline-wise for this project, which has been going on for about a year to a year and a half now. If you have any questions when we're done presenting, you can feel free to email Ryan with the City of Baytown. His email address is on the screen, and he will be able to answer your question or get with us, and we'll provide an answer for whatever question or concern or comment that you might have. Here's a timeline for the overall project. We started in September of 2022 with several introductory activities like interviewing stakeholders and focus groups, producing an annotated outline, which shows how we would propose this new Unified Land Development Code to be laid out, and also producing a ULDC framework or a critique of the existing regulations and spelling out the things that we think should change in it to bring it up to best practices nationally with zoning regulations, and to, more importantly, perhaps, make sure that it implements the policy and guidance of the comprehensive plan. Into phase two, which is public engagement and is an ongoing part of this process, we've done several presentations to city staff and to a code advisory committee made up of non-city staff, updating them along the way as to the pieces that we've been working on in the Unified Land Development Code draft. We've had several meetings and presentations to the general public as well. And also part of that phase is to work on and revise the drafts that we've produced as we get feedback from various groups of people. Phase three is to evaluate the form-based districts. Those are a special set of districts that we'll go into during this presentation that would impact and be applied to two specific areas of town that are more design focused as opposed to kind of more traditional land development regulation focused. In phase four, we actually draft the modules that make up the Unified Land Development Code draft, presented them and received feedback from various groups of people, and then we are shooting for July of this year for adoption of the Unified Land Development Code. It will have to go through the typical public process for when a zoning map amendment is adopted or a change to the current regulations are adopted, where it needs to go to the Planning and Zoning Commission for a public hearing and a recommendation, and then goes, generally speaking, to the City Council for their final action on the contents of the new Unified Land Development Code. We drafted the Unified Land Development Code in 3 modules. The contents of those modules are shown on the screen here. The first module had to do with just the general provisions of like the purpose of the ULDC, where it applies, which is basically much of it within the city limits and in the extraterritorial jurisdiction, but also some of it can only apply within the city limits by state law. And then also the zoning districts and land use standards and definitions were in module 1. Each of these modules, we would provide a draft to staff who would comment on the draft. We'd get those comments, integrate them into the draft, and then they would go on to review by other groups, like I mentioned earlier, such as the Code Advisory Committee. The second module contained site development standards and subdivision standards. These are the standards that relate to parking and landscaping, signs, building exterior, as well as the subdivision standards that relate to how streets are laid out and how lots or undeveloped property is subdivided out into lots, which can then kind of typically be sold to home builders or home buyers to build a house on or build some other kind of building on. The third module contained provisions for form-based regulations. Again, that's the more design-specific regulations that apply to two areas of the city, the downtown and the San Jacinto Boulevard area. And also Module 3 has rules for administration and review procedures. So laying out the different duties of the Planning and Zoning Commission or the planning director and other groups like that, and then showing what processes have to take place in order for a applicant to get a decision on whether it's a variance or a site plan or a change in zoning or other kinds of submittals and applications that the city has that are related to land development. All these modules eventually are being combined into a single public hearing draft that will, as I mentioned, go to the Planning and Zoning Commission for their consideration and ultimately to City Council for their final decision. This is a list of key changes that are proposed in the new Unified Land Development Code. The first is consolidating the zoning district, several of the zoning districts, and build in a character-based approach to many of the districts and the development standards, taking the city's existing zoning districts and looking for opportunities to consolidate them and make them more efficient and make them more usable so that down the road, potentially, there won't be as much of a need for plan developments or changing in zoning, and that all works toward streamlining the regulations, which is a recommendation of the comprehensive plan. Another key change has to do with housing types, adding in several different new kinds of housing types that weren't contemplated or addressed in the current set of regulations. There is a trend in planning and zoning called missing middle housing, which is a desire by cities to accommodate and encourage where appropriate housing types that fall sort of in the middle of the spectrum between single family and apartment. And so having provisions that allow for duplexes, for quadruplexes or fourplexes, along with the usual single family detached housing and multifamily housing. Revising the parking standards also was part of this project. Keeping the requirements for the minimum amount of parking that has to be provided for housing for residential uses, but removing those minimum requirements of off-street parking for non-residential uses so that an applicant, someone doing a shopping center or a manufacturing facility or whatever the case may be, can consider how much parking they believe they're going to need based on the land use that they're doing and providing that amount and not making the city or having the city dictate the minimum amount that they have to provide. This has several benefits, some related to drainage and to reducing the urban heat island effect, and is another sort of trend that I mentioned previously with the housing type and the missing middle item that I talked about previously. And then finally, consolidating and streamlining the development review procedures so that conflicts are removed from within the document and just providing greater consistency as staff is reviewing submittals for doing different kinds of developments. Getting into some specifics about the content of the Unified Land Development Code. Article 2 is kind of the first substantial article in the new code. That's the residential, that partially contains the residential districts and the rules that apply to them. Within the residential zoning districts, there are 4 development types that are spelled out. Those are conventional, cluster, infill, and cottage court. And we have an image of each of those types of development here on the slide. Conventional is just sort of what you typically see and have been seeing for decades and will continue to see in many places in Baytown, which is single family or duplex development on lots that have maybe a minimum amount of open space and that are sort of designed as you kind of see on the image on the upper left. The next one, clustering or cluster development type, is a style of development where if a developer will provide an increased amount of open space, as you can see in sort of the light green in the image on the upper right, then if they'll do that, permanently provide that open space, then it will result in them getting more units per acre than what they would have gotten if they had done the conventional development type. So they get a bonus in the number of lots or the number of units in the development in exchange for providing this public good, which is that open space that you see there. The next on the list is infill, and that is represented in the lower right image. And infill development is where if there is a lot or a group of lots that's surrounded by development on all sides or on 2 or 3 sides of it that is sitting there and it has not been developed or has dilapidated structures on it. Infill is making use of that property that is already being served by a street, is already being served by utilities in all likelihood, and doing something with it and developing it so that it contributes more to the tax base and doesn't appear as an eyesore in the neighborhood. We can provide incentives in the ULDC incentives for taking land like that, an applicant taking that type of land and doing a development on it so that that applicant gets more lots out of the deal again than they would have in a conventional development. And then finally, cottage court on the lower left. That is a style of development where 6 or so smaller residential structures, 6 or so smaller houses on smaller lots front on a common green. So as opposed to having individual backyards or individualized front yards, they front on a common green area that everyone there in the cottage court can take advantage of. This allows for a little bit more density also in the housing and can allow for more affordable housing as well. So these are the residential development types we've worked into the residential districts. Now for a view of how we've consolidated many of the existing zoning districts in Baytown into new districts. You'll notice that at minimum, the terminology has changed in a lot of cases, so that instead of saying SF1, which to a layperson might not mean much, we use more descriptive terms like SR, suburban residential, or MR, mixed residential, to try to give a better idea about what the district sort of is trying to create as far as community character when it's applied to a piece of property. So this table shows how each of the districts have either been consolidated or sometimes split apart, as we'll see on the next slides, and whether those districts there in the center column are new that are proposed or if they're sort of reworkings of existing districts. Then on the right column, you can see each of those development types that I discussed earlier on the previous slide. It shows how those work in to this setup of these new proposed districts. These are the mixed use and special districts. You can see we've combined your existing mixed use and livable center into just a mixed use neighborhood district. And we've retained the downtown and San Jacinto districts, at least in name, how they have been, but there's a lot of substantial changes in those districts that are proposed. And then finally here, or not quite finally, but the second to last slide related to the combining and the splitting off of districts. These are the non-residential districts, taking your neighborhood commercial and sort of retaining that terminology, but then with general commercial, splitting it up into general and freeway commercial, which, as the name sounds like, the freeway commercial would be applied more to the frontages of the interstate. Then the 2 industrial districts have remained with their current names, but again, as with the other ones, there's been some reworking of the provisions that go along with each of them. And then finally, for the special purpose and overlay districts, retaining your plan unit development and retaining your drilling overlay. Plan unit developments, we hope that you will see a downturn in the number of plan unit developments that are done. And that hope is based on the fact that the new ULDC should be very flexible and accommodate a lot of different development types without an applicant having to go through the time and expense and uncertainty that often accompanies the plan unit development review process. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Steve to continue the presentation.
Thank you, Brian. A new approach and a way to reinforce the historic character of Baytown, particularly in some areas in the downtown area, but also to create a new form in undeveloped areas such as along San Jacinto Boulevard. We're introducing a form of zoning called form districts. And so the purpose of these are really to kind of create a sense of place, reinforce a historic fabric, or set a new fabric in the case of San Jacinto. And what these do, these form districts provide a regulatory framework for implementing a vision for those areas. They put a strong emphasis on sense of place and really help to reinforce a pedestrian-friendly, walkable environment. And most importantly, the way form districts function is that they acknowledge that uses change over time, but the built form should remain generally the same. And so what these districts, the way we've organized these districts are they, and Brian, to the next slide. The way the two districts that we've introduced function, we have this Downtown Arts District and the San Jacinto District, formerly the ACE District for Downtown Arts, and the San Jacinto was formerly or currently an overlay. Both of these will be base zoning districts or form districts. Same idea, that we're taking a form-based approach. These two districts will include a set of dimensional and development standards. Both will include sub-districts. So it's not the entire area of both of those districts. They're subdivided into smaller areas that represent the different intentions and guidance for those sub-areas. So for example, the Downtown Arts District will include a main street and then a flexible district for everything outside of that. The same with San Jacinto, will have a main and flexible in another sub-area to address more housing type of opportunities. So, but the standards in these districts are just as in the zoning districts are represented by clearly labeled graphics, illustrative graphics, and tables to represent some of the standards. So I'm going to, in the next few slides, I'll show you some of those standards, how they may be a little bit different than the zoning districts. The first approach is the use of frontage types. And what these frontage types do is they function as a way to reinforce that public-private realm and reinforce this idea of more walkability. So think of porches, storefronts, that type of approach. They define the relationship between the building and the public realm, not just the function, but also the aesthetic appearance of that. And so not all frontage types will be applicable to all the sub areas. So we've set up a table to clearly define that. And I'll just give you a brief overview of what each of these are on the next slide. So there's 6 different frontage types introduced to the ULDC here. The shop front is one that most people are very familiar with. You have large windows facing upon the sidewalk, often defined by they're covered with canopies or awnings to project over the sidewalk along the frontage. The gallery type is something you see quite often in southern states. What it is, the front facade is within the build-to zone, basically the zone between the right-of-way and the building facade, where it's permitted, and it has a covered walkway or an arcade, with or without usable or habitable space above. These galleries can encroach over the sidewalk, and most importantly, protect the pedestrians from the elements rain and sun, which is very important in the Baytown area. The dooryard and terrace frontage type, the building may be set back a small distance, but it is within the build to zone. So the frontage line is generally defined by a garden wall or fence or small hedge. The dooryard may be at grade or raised as a terrace. And so the next one is the stoop type. This is where the main facade of the building is within the build to zone. And the stoop provides access to the first floor that is elevated to provide separation from the sidewalk and ensure privacy with the building. The forecourt type is a very historic type that you see in a lot of communities, especially in the West Coast or in some of the more traditional neighborhoods of the Midwest. What this is a way that the primary portion of the front facade is within basically right on the right-of-way line or within the build-to zone, but a small percentage is set back to kind of create this interior courtyard space. It's a private space. It can be used in an entry court or a garden space. It can be used for outdoor seating, dining, or even retail. And then the last one is the porch, something that everybody's familiar with. It's used to access the first floor. Often it's elevated from the sidewalk. And this is really to kind of ensure privacy within the building. So the graphics clearly define these dimensions, the build to zone and the height and all these factors. So, but it's a flexible tool. There's not one type that has to be used. There's flexibility within that. The next way that we have key change to the code is as Brian mentioned earlier, to increase the housing types. And the goal is to create more options for a variety of households, whether it's a young family or an elderly couple or elderly individuals who want to downsize. Key is to address the demand in the market. And what we've done is define more housing types that are beyond what are currently defined or available in Baytown by the code. And so what the idea is to create more flexibility and most importantly, more by right options within the existing zoning districts, especially within the medium to higher density residential zones and mixed use zones. And some of these are new types. The multiplex is basically a small apartment building, small building that's often the size of a larger single family house. But it may only contain 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 units within that structure. The next type is a live-work unit where the owner resides in the same building that they work in. Often it's a first floor office or some sort of specialty service, and they'll live upstairs. Another type that's introduced here is a cottage court. It's not just a development type, but also a way to put smaller cottages, usually 800 to 1,000 square feet at a minimum, open that front upon an open space, clustered on that. So these often fit into a little larger lot, but provide a way for a more built-in communal type of living or easier way for households to not have to still have some open space, but not have to maintain it as much. The next type is upper story residential. Basically, what it sounds like, but it's not owned like the live work. It'd be a building that has a mixed use, a vertical mixed use building. And then the single unit attached it's like a duplex, but they're on separate lot lines. So think of something like a patio home, but there are different ways to develop this. Moving on, the zoning districts, each of these include a set of dimensional standards, just like what I was talking about in the form districts. They're differentiated by housing type and also by development type. So an example you see on the slide here, you have a conventional development type, but also an infill development type in this particular zone. You may have a cluster type or various types that are defined in each district. The densities for these districts are aligned with the recommended densities from the new comprehensive plan, and the standards are displayed as both text, table, and illustrative graphics to really facilitate the ease of use for all applicants and decision makers. All right, moving on. So we've taken a slightly different approach to land uses than the existing regulations. For one, we wanted to make sure we update the use list to reflect the city's needs and emerging practices, especially post-COVID. And we want to implement the comprehensive plan, the policies within that, also to simplify the administration of it, and in many ways to find ways to consolidate very similar uses that have similar functions, right? So in doing that, we organize by grouping uses in a more logical fashion. In many situations, we expanded upon modern land uses and standards as well. Going on. With the use table, very similar as the existing regulations. However, we've added these new functions to it, and I'll go over them in the next few slides, particularly the use with use categories, as well as a way to simplify the way use standards are communicated in the code. Moving forward. So the use table, the consolidated use table, can best be explained by using kind of going through how it's organized. We use abbreviations just as the current one does, but are applicable in all zoning districts. All zoning districts are in one table, but there are subdivisions within those for based on development type. But these are really just for the residential types or by the sub areas within the form districts. The uses are separated. Number 3 here, you'll see the uses are separated into different categories. So the agriculture and animal use services would be separated, or we divide it in the table, and then there'll be residential, commercial, industrial, etc. And then the uses within each category is separated into these use categories. And I'll explain briefly what I mean by the use categories here in a second. Moving on. The next kind of element of this use table is the specific uses are organized, reorganized and refined with new definitions and new ways of terming things. Many of these are the same as that currently exist. The permissions are set out by the district or the sub area or the development type. And then the applicable use specific standards are cross-referenced in the table and are in a separate section of the code or within this article. Next one. So I mentioned earlier the use categories. This is a new approach, and the benefit of this is it provides a way to, one, shorten the consolidated use table, but also to help kind of provide input on the parking table where it's applicable. And this allows the use table to be to focus on things that have similar functions. So a household living, you have a set of primary uses that are very similar, and then also the typical accessory uses with those standard uses. And then each of these use categories have a basic kind of a category definition. And the real benefit of this is it provides a way, if there's not a use that's defined in the table, it allows a way for interpretation based on the intent of the category and similar type of uses that are within, primary uses that would be within each of the categories. All right, moving on. A new approach. There are some forms of temporary uses in the existing code, but are not organized in the way that we are proposing for this update. The key way each of these temporary uses are defined, and they're organized by the use or structure type. We've also defined the duration by the max of days per year and the amount per year, and then the use setting by the zoning district. And this can be, and it's defined by whether it's a permit is required, or if it's not no permit is required. So it's a lot easier to interpret, to administer, and to just facilitate the use of temporary uses, which has commonly become more frequently used in communities. Moving forward, I
Okay,
believe Brian. Yeah.
yeah, thank you, Steve. The final segment of this presentation has to do with the changes and improvements to the development review procedures that are in the new proposed Unified Land Development Code. We've consolidated the provisions that are in the existing regulations, the existing review procedures, into a single consolidated set of review steps that take place. And that's at the very front of the review procedures article, spelled out several different things that we'll get into about what has to happen kind of across all of the applications. And then the approach is then for specific things like a sign permit or a variance or other review procedures like that, spell out the unique things later on about what needs to happen as far as review for each of those individual applications. Doing it this way results in less chance for duplicating material or having inconsistent wording for each of the applications. We've established a clear review criteria for decision makers to consider, whether it's the Planning and Zoning Commission or staff members or City Council, clear criteria for them to consider when deciding to approve or not approve a submitted application. All of this provides the applicant with options for fulfilling the standards when they submit an application, and overall results in the overall goal of having more administrative decision-making ability rather than an over-reliance on public hearings for items and application requests that might not ideally need a public hearing, especially I think in terms of the final plat decision-making process, which is a very technical document, yet in many cities has to go to the Planning and Zoning Commission for their final action, when it's a very technical document that and drawing that many members of the public don't understand because we're not engineers. So just more administrative decision-making ability makes this an important and advantageous characteristic of the ULDC. Making sure that roles are clarified, procedures are clarified, and any kind of cross-references to the standards that are in the ULDC are clear in here. The comprehensive plan recommends that the development regulations be streamlined. And so we've taken our guidance from that recommendation in the comprehensive plan. The development review applications are split up into 4 different types. There's administrative decisions that are acted on by staff that don't require a public notice or public hearing and that just follow objective standards. You check the box of yes, they did this. Yes, the application shows this and this and this. Those are all checked off and can be then approved. These are smaller requests like, again, a sign permit, building permit, and some other items like that. Then there are master plans, amendments, and special uses. These are definitely bigger decisions that are often decided upon by the City Council or maybe the Planning and Zoning Commission. It just depends on the specific application, but these have a broader impact than just something like a sign permit. This might be an amendment to the ULDC itself, or a special use, something that is going to have impact on neighboring properties potentially, that the ULDC says should have a public hearing and provide the opportunity for public comment before the decision is made. Variances and administrative appeals are the next group. These are the types of applications that the Board of Adjustment takes action on. Variance is a request to sort of break the rules of the ULDC, where if there is a 25-foot setback required and the applicant has a good reason to ask for instead a 20-foot front building setback, then that would be a variance request in order to do that. And so the applicant provides a rationale for doing it, and the staff arranges for a public hearing to take place, provides an analysis of the request, and then the Board of Adjustment makes its final decision based on several factors. An administrative appeal is another similar request where an applicant disagrees with a decision of a staff member, or not necessarily an applicant, but anyone agrees with a decision of a staff member, and can appeal that decision, and then it goes through the process. And then finally, subdivision review, which is its own thing that's not really falling within the previous three categorizations, where it's decisions related to subdivision plats, where a raw piece of property is split up into smaller lots and provided with streets and utilities and other types of infrastructure like that. I mentioned how the review procedures have been sort of consolidated into a common set of review procedures, and this gives sort of a visual to that thought. There is one table that is sort of essential to the whole article, and we have an excerpt of that on the screen. It is the summary of procedures table. And just to use an example, a minor or amending plat is circled on the screen here. The table shows the name of the application, obviously on the far left column. The next column shows the submittal timing of when a person needs to provide and submit and have approved a minor or amending plat. The next two columns show if public or pre-application conference is needed or not. That's going to apply to the bigger picture change it request, like a rezoning or master development plan, as opposed to something smaller like a minor or amending plat. And then public notice, also that column there shows what kinds of notice, whether it's mailed or newspaper type of notice that's needed for that particular application. The next columns show who makes a recommendation and who takes final action on the request. In this case, for the minor or amending plat, it's the planning director who takes the final action. So it's just one cell there that's merged together as far as recommendation and final action. The expiration column shows when the request or that particular application expires if nothing is ever done. So in this case, if a minor or amending plat were approved, but the applicant never recorded it in the county land records, then it would expire after two years after approval. This is to make sure that things don't just linger forever, sort of in the records of the planning department, and that people are actually following through with the requests that they're making. And then finally, that cross-reference column points to the standards that relate to that type of application. And so for a minor or amending plat, it's going to point to the subdivision standards, which are Article 4. This is a very handy kind of one-stop shop for getting a view of what most of the things you're going to need to know about any of the applications that are addressed in the ULDC. And finally, almost finally, the upcoming steps for adoption of this ULDC. This presentation we're recording right now was going to take place in person at an open house, but for various reasons, including really bad weather on the day it was to happen, we've instead recorded it, and it will be provided on the city's website and possibly other venues. The dates that you see on the screen are fairly set in stone, but could also be thought of as somewhat semi-tentative. But we believe that these are, you can pretty much bank on these dates taking place, where there will be a joint work session on June 13th. There will be a presentation of the public hearing draft to the Planning and Zoning Commission on June 18th, a presentation to City Council on the same thing on June 27th. City Council will hold a second public hearing on July 11th, and then finally July 16th, Planning and Zoning Commission will make its formal recommendation to City Council, and then on July 25th, we anticipate City Council to adopt the Unified Land Development Code. If you would like to comment on this document, it will soon be available at the website that you see on the screen, engage.baytown.org/ULDC-update. And you will see something similar to what you see on the slide now. This is for a different project, so it's not exactly the same, but there will be something like a comment box on the left side of the text that you can click. And once you do that, you can choose the area that you, or the section or subsection that you want to comment on from a drop-down menu, and then select that section for comment by clicking that button at the bottom. And then you'll be able to provide your name and email and a comment on what you've on that section and submit it. And it will make its way to city staff and to us, and we'll be able to consider that when we're making any final updates to the Unified Land Development Code draft. So this concludes our presentation, and we appreciate you listening, and we hope that you'll become involved in giving your thoughts and opinions on this very important project. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
All right.